The wind didn't sound like wind anymore. It sounded like timber breaking. Daniel Cole leaned his full weight against the barn door, while snow blasted through every crack around its frame. The lantern hanging above him swung so violently, its light flashed across frightened horses, stacked hay, and the terrified face of 12-year-old Tommy Hargrove. "The south hinge," Tommy shouted. Daniel couldn't hear him. He only saw the boy pointing. Another gust slammed into the barn. The entire building shuddered. Dust drifted from the rafters. One frightened mare reared, snapping the lead rope from Eli's frozen hands. The horse charged toward the open aisle. "Leave her!" Daniel roared. Eli didn't move. The boy lunged after the mare anyway. Daniel caught him by the collar just as another deafening crack echoed overhead. Everyone looked up. One of the roof beams had split. Outside, something even worse happened. The sharp metallic bell hanging beside the well suddenly disappeared beneath the roar of the storm. Daniel knew exactly what that meant. The wind had shifted. That wasn't supposed to happen for another 6 hours. His eyes narrowed. "No." Sarah looked at him. "What is it?" Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he sprinted toward the door. Sarah grabbed his arm. "You can't go out there. If I don't—" He looked toward the distant cattle shed, now almost invisible behind the wall of white. "You won't have a ranch left by morning." Before anyone could stop him, he disappeared into the blizzard. The door slammed shut behind him. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Tommy stared at the swirling snow outside. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "He came here asking us to feed his son for 1 week." Sarah couldn't take her eyes off the storm. "And now he's risking his life for people he barely knows." She tightened her grip on the door latch. The question that had haunted her for weeks returned stronger than ever. Who was Daniel Cole, really? And why had he been so certain winter would come? If you believe the strongest people are often the quietest, subscribe for more unforgettable frontier stories. And before we go back to where this all began, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? The first frost arrived before sunrise, not enough to whiten the fields, just enough to leave silver edges on every blade of grass. Sarah Hargrove noticed it while carrying water from the pump. The bucket felt heavier than usual. Everything had lately. Since Matthew died, every chore seemed to belong to one pair of hands instead of two. The ranch still looked prosperous from the road. The fences stood straight. The barn still wore its faded red paint. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney. Travelers passing through would have seen a thriving Wyoming ranch. Only Sarah knew better. She knew which fence posts had begun to rot below the soil where nobody could see them. She knew the western pasture produced thinner grass every year because spring runoff had quietly carved away the richest earth. She knew exactly how many sacks of oats remained in the granary. 23. Last autumn, there had been 61. She also knew something else. The banknote folded inside her apron pocket came due 3 weeks after Christmas. If winter was harsh, there wouldn't be enough cattle left to pay it. She unfolded the paper anyway. Sometimes people reread bad news hoping the words might somehow change. They never did. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Not loud, just 3 steady taps. She opened the door, expecting another salesman. Instead, she found a stranger standing beside a handcart. His coat had been patched so many times, it was impossible to tell its original color. His boots were worn nearly smooth. A canvas tool roll rested across one shoulder. Beside him stood a thin boy of about 11. The boy tried not to stare at the loaf of fresh bread, cooling on Sarah's kitchen windowsill. He failed. Daniel noticed. Without a word, he gently rested one hand on the boy's shoulder. Not to stop him, to comfort him. "My name's Daniel Cole." His voice was calm. "This is my son, Eli." Sarah nodded politely. "What can I do for you?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes wandered across the ranch, the barn, the hay shed, the well, the cottonwoods lining the western lane, the smoke drifting from the chimney, the sagging corner of the machine shed, the creek, the hills beyond it. He studied everything. Only then did he look back at Sarah. "I'm looking for work. I can't afford another ranch hand. I wasn't asking for wages." That caught her attention. "What are you asking for?" Daniel glanced toward Eli. The boy shifted his weight but said nothing. His stomach answered instead. The quiet growl carried across the porch. Daniel never looked embarrassed. He simply met Sarah's eyes. "Feed my son for 1 week." A long pause settled between them. Then he finished. "And I'll save your ranch." Sarah almost laughed. Not because she wanted to be cruel. Because the offer sounded impossible. "You haven't even stepped through my gate." "I don't need to. You already know my ranch." "I know enough." He pointed toward the barn. "Your main doors face northwest." She blinked. "So? The strongest winter winds here come from that direction." He pointed toward the hay shed. "Your hay's stacked directly on packed earth." Then toward the well. "The pump house has no insulated skirt." Finally, he pointed toward the line of cottonwoods. "Those trees will bury your lane under 6-foot snowdrifts before New Year's." Sarah folded her arms. "You've been here less than a minute." Daniel nodded. "Long enough." Tommy, who had wandered out carrying a bucket of feed, frowned. "How can you know all that?" Daniel smiled at him. "Come here." He picked up a handful of dry dust from the edge of the yard. Then he let it fall. The breeze carried it in a gentle arc before it settled behind a fence post. "What did you see?" "The dirt blew away." "No." Daniel shook his head. "It stopped." "Where?" Tommy looked closer. "Behind the post." "Exactly." Daniel pointed toward the cottonwoods. "Snow behaves the same way. It doesn't pile where the wind is strongest. It piles where the wind suddenly slows." Tommy turned to look at the trees. For the first time, he wasn't seeing trees. He was seeing next winter. Sarah noticed the change in the boy's face. So did Daniel. He hadn't simply answered a question. He'd changed the way Tommy looked at the world. That impressed her far more than confidence. Still, confidence wasn't proof. "You said you'd save my ranch." Daniel nodded. "I did." "That's a mighty large promise." "It is." "What makes you think you can keep it?" Daniel looked past her toward the mountains. For a long moment he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost quiet enough to miss. "Because I already know what winter takes from people who aren't ready." He didn't explain. He didn't need to. Something in his eyes told Sarah that answer had cost him dearly. And for the first time, she wondered if the stranger standing on her porch wasn't running toward work. Maybe he'd been running away from a memory. Sarah didn't answer right away. She looked from Daniel to Eli, then back again. Years of running the ranch alone had taught her one lesson above all others. People lied far more easily than broken buildings. Buildings always told the truth. "You said you know enough about my ranch," she said at last. "Show me." Daniel nodded once. He didn't reach for his tools. He reached for his hat. "Let's walk." Tommy hurried after them. Eli followed quietly, keeping both hands in his coat pockets against the morning chill. Daniel didn't step into the barn. He stopped 20 feet short. His eyes stayed fixed on the roofline. Sarah frowned. "Aren't you going inside?" "In a minute." "What are you looking at?" "The swallows." She followed his gaze. Dozens of barn swallows darted beneath the eaves before disappearing toward the creek. "I don't understand." "They've already started leaving." Tommy squinted. "So?" Daniel smiled. "Birds rarely argue with winter. They leave before we believe it." Tommy frowned. "My pa always said the first snow comes when the geese fly." Daniel shook his head. "That's when people notice. The swallows know weeks earlier." Sarah looked back toward the empty sky. Matthew used to notice little things like that. She never had. Maybe she'd been too busy noticing bills instead. Daniel finally entered the barn. He said nothing for nearly a full minute. Instead, he listened. The slow chewing of cattle, leather creaking against harness hooks, the distant drip, drip, drip of water somewhere in the shadows. He walked straight toward the sound. Tommy blinked. "How'd you know where it was?" "I didn't. I listened. Behind a stack of grain sacks, a narrow pipe leaked one drop every few seconds." Sarah sighed. "I've been meaning to fix that." Daniel crouched beside it. "No." She looked puzzled. "No? You've been meaning to stop the drip. That's different." He held one finger beneath the water. "The leak isn't the problem. The problem's somewhere upstream." Tommy scratched his head. "How can you tell?" Daniel pointed toward the damp beam overhead. "If this pipe burst yesterday, that wood wouldn't already be stained." Sarah stepped closer. The beam above was nearly black. She'd walked beneath it every morning for more than a year. She had never looked up. Daniel climbed onto a hay bale and pressed gently against the beam. It moved. Only a little, but enough. He climbed back down. Has anyone noticed this roof sagging? Sarah slowly nodded. A little. Daniel looked toward the center of the barn. It isn't sagging. It's twisting. Tommy frowned. What's the difference? Daniel picked up 2 thin sticks. He bent one straight downward. This is sagging. Then he twisted the second. And this is a building trying to tear itself apart. Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. Can it be repaired? It can. Will it be expensive? Daniel smiled faintly. Not if we do it before the first heavy snow. He paused. If we wait, the snow will do the demolition for us. Nobody spoke. The barn suddenly felt older than it had an hour before. When they returned to the house, Sarah ladled stew into 4 bowls. She hesitated over the 5th, then quietly filled another. Eli noticed. So did Daniel. You don't have to, Sarah interrupted him. I know. She set the bowl in front of Eli. But hungry children don't build strong fences. Eli looked at his father for permission. Daniel gave a single nod. Thank you, ma'am. The boy ate slowly, as though he had learned somewhere that eating too fast might make the food disappear. Tommy watched him. You can have my biscuit. Eli shook his head. You eat it. I've got 2. So do you now. Tommy pushed the biscuit across the table anyway. Daniel pretended not to notice. Some acts of kindness deserved privacy. Sarah pretended not to notice too. But inside, something softened. The sound of hoofbeats echoed across the yard. Daniel didn't even turn around. You've got company. Sarah looked toward the lane. A tall man in a dark coat rode through the gate without waiting to be invited. Tommy's smile disappeared. Walt. Walt Ferris swung easily from the saddle. He removed his gloves with deliberate slowness. His eyes swept over Daniel, the measuring string, the open toolbox, then the untouched hammer. So, he said, this is the fellow who's going to save your ranch. Sarah answered before Daniel could. He's finding problems before he fixes them. Walt chuckled. That's convenient. You can spend all winter looking. Daniel finally met his eyes, and spend spring rebuilding what winter destroyed. For a heartbeat, neither man moved. Walt's smile thinned. I've worked these valleys 30 years. I don't need lectures from a drifter. Daniel's voice remained calm. I wasn't giving one. I was talking to Tommy. Tommy looked back and forth between them. He had never seen 2 men disagree without raising their voices. Oddly, that made the silence feel even heavier. Walt stepped closer to the barn. He slapped one of the support posts with the palm of his hand. Looks solid enough to me. Daniel didn't argue. Instead, he walked to the opposite side of the barn. He knelt, then picked up a handful of fine sawdust lying beneath the sill. He held it out. Worm dust. Walt shrugged. So? Daniel pointed to the post Walt had just struck. Hit it again. Harder this time. Walt obliged. The post sounded solid. Then, a thin stream of pale powder trickled from a narrow crack near its base. Tommy's eyes widened. Daniel said quietly, outside, it looks strong. Inside, it's almost hollow. Walt stared at the post for a long second. He had no answer, but before climbing back onto his horse, he left one final warning. You've got less than a month before the mountains close. He looked directly at Sarah. If you're betting your ranch, I hope you're betting on the right man. He rode away without another word. Sarah watched him disappear over the ridge. Then she looked at Daniel. For the first time, she asked the question she'd been holding back since he arrived. What happened to your ranch? Daniel didn't answer. Not immediately. His eyes drifted toward Eli. The boy had wandered into the pasture with Tommy, laughing as they tried to outrun a stubborn calf. A faint smile crossed Daniel's face. Then it disappeared. I'll tell you. He looked toward the mountains. But not today, because some stories were still too heavy to carry in daylight. The next morning, Daniel was already outside when the first rays of sunlight touched the frost-covered pasture. He wasn't carrying a hammer. He wasn't carrying a shovel. He carried only a small strip of red cloth. Tommy watched curiously from the porch. What's that for? Daniel tied the cloth to the end of an old fence post. The breeze caught it immediately. It fluttered twice, then turned sharply north. Daniel smiled. Thought so. Tommy hurried over. You keep smiling at the wind. The wind tells the truth. It never worries about hurting your feelings. Sarah stepped onto the porch carrying a cup of coffee. And what truth did it tell you today? Daniel pointed toward the cottonwoods lining the western lane. We're changing our plans. Sarah frowned. I thought today was the barn. It was. What changed? The wind. An hour later, Daniel stood before the line of cottonwoods with an axe resting against his shoulder. Tommy looked disappointed. We're cutting trees again? No. We're planting. Sarah blinked. Planting? In autumn? Daniel nodded. The best time to prepare for next winter is before this one arrives. He knelt and drew a long line in the dirt. The trees over there protect your house. He pointed toward the west. But nothing protects your cattle. Sarah looked across the open pasture. The animals stood completely exposed. We can't grow a forest before winter. We don't need one. Daniel smiled. We need snow fence. Tommy tilted his head. What's a snow fence? Daniel picked up several fallen cottonwood branches. People think a snow fence stops snow. It doesn't. It tells the wind where to drop it. He drove one branch into the ground, then another, leaving gaps between them. Tommy frowned. Shouldn't they be closer together? Daniel shook his head. If it's solid, the wind climbs over it. If it's open, the wind slows down. He spread his fingers. Nature likes choices, not walls. Sarah watched him build the first section. It looked almost too simple. Certainly too simple to matter. Daniel noticed her expression. The strongest things on a ranch are usually the least impressive. While Daniel and Tommy worked, Eli wandered toward the creek, carrying 2 empty buckets. Halfway there, he stopped. He crouched, then called back. Dad. Daniel looked up immediately. What is it? Eli pointed toward the muddy bank. There are tracks. Tommy jogged over. A deer? Daniel knelt beside them. No. He brushed away a little mud. Coyote. Tommy shrugged. So? Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he followed the prints. 20 yards farther, they stopped beside a gap beneath the old sheep fence. His expression changed. Sarah saw it. What? They're testing us. She frowned. Who's testing us? The coyotes. Tommy laughed. They're animals. They don't make plans. Daniel looked directly at him. Oh, they absolutely do. That night, Daniel repaired the gap before darkness settled. Tommy looked puzzled. We don't even have sheep anymore. No, but we have calves. He patted the repaired fence. Predators always look for the easiest meal. The goal isn't making your ranch impossible. It's making another ranch easier. Sarah smiled. I suppose that's true for bankers too. Daniel laughed. The difference is, coyotes don't wear neckties. Even Sarah laughed at that. It was the first time since Matthew's death that laughter echoed across the yard after sunset. Tommy noticed. So did Eli. Neither boy said anything, but both smiled a little longer than usual. Later that evening, Sarah spread the ranch books across the kitchen table. Daniel studied them silently. Not the debts, not the payments, the feed records, the calving records, the weather notes Matthew had scribbled in the margins. Finally, he tapped one page. Did your husband always write this much? Sarah smiled softly. He said memory lies. Paper doesn't. Daniel nodded. He was right. He flipped back 3 winters, then 4. Suddenly, he stopped. What? Sarah asked. He pointed to a single sentence Matthew had written 5 years earlier. Lost 7 calves after ice sealed the lower spring. Must never let it happen again. Daniel looked up. Where's the lower spring? Sarah's smile vanished. We stopped using it. Why? The upper well was easier. Daniel closed the ledger. Easier is a dangerous word. The next morning, the 4 of them hiked nearly half a mile through waist-high grass until Tommy stopped beside a cluster of rocks. It's here. At first, Sarah saw nothing. Then Daniel brushed aside dead leaves. Cold, clear water bubbled quietly from beneath the stones. It still runs. Sarah stared. I haven't been here in years. Daniel smiled. That's exactly why it matters. He filled his hands with water. Taste it. Tommy drank first. It's freezing. Daniel nodded. Good. The deeper the spring, the longer it resists. Freezing. Sarah looked toward the ranch. You think we'll need it? Daniel's answer came without hesitation. I don't think. I hope. But hope isn't a plan. 2 afternoons later, Walt Ferris rode into the yard again. This time he wasn't alone. Behind him came a black wagon bearing the logo of First Territorial Bank. Sarah's stomach tightened. The banker climbed down first. Mrs. Hargrove. He removed his gloves politely. I'm simply making my seasonal inspection. Daniel continued stacking firewood. He never looked up. The banker walked slowly around the property. His expression remained unreadable. Finally, he stopped beside the partially rebuilt windbreak. Sarah held her breath. Then, unexpectedly, he nodded. These improvements weren't here last month. No, they weren't. He looked toward Daniel. Who's responsible? Daniel finally stood. I am. The banker studied him for a long moment, then looked back at Sarah. Whatever he's doing, tell him not to stop. Walt's expression darkened. The banker continued. If this ranch enters winter looking the way it did in October, I'd be preparing foreclosure papers. He glanced toward the strengthened barn, the raised hay floor, the repaired fencing, the organized woodpile. But today, he smiled slightly. I see someone preparing to survive, for the first time. Walt had nothing to say. That evening, Daniel stood alone outside the barn. Sarah joined him. What are you looking at? The mountains. I can't see them. Exactly. The peaks had vanished behind a thick gray wall of cloud. No snow yet. No wind. Just silence. Daniel's jaw tightened. When mountains disappear this early, they're building something. Sarah folded her arms against the growing cold. How much time? Daniel answered quietly. If we're lucky, 10 days. Then he looked across everything they had repaired. The barn, the fences, the hay, the windbreak, the cattle, the boys laughing near the corral. Finally, his eyes settled on the old machine shed. He hadn't touched it. Not once. Sarah noticed. You've ignored that building since the day you arrived. Daniel nodded slowly. Because I was hoping. I wouldn't need what's inside. Sarah frowned. What is inside? Daniel looked at the weather-darkened doors. The only thing on this ranch that can save every animal if the blizzard lasts longer than a week. He walked toward the shed, reached for the rusted handle, then stopped. The padlock hanging from the latch had already been broken. Someone had been inside. Daniel reached for the broken padlock. It swung loosely from the latch. Someone hadn't forced the door. They had opened it with a key. He slowly pushed the weathered doors apart. The smell hit him first. Old grease, dry leather, dust. Sunlight spilled through gaps in the boards, revealing an empty wagon, broken harnesses, cracked barrels, and a space against the back wall where something large had once stood. Sarah stopped beside him. What was there? Daniel knelt. Deep grooves had been worn into the floorboards, heavy, on iron runners. He brushed away the dust with his glove. They took the feed sled. Sarah frowned. The what? The emergency sled. Matthew had built it years ago after the blizzard of '88. Wide runners, heavy oak frame, strong enough to carry hay across drifts where wagons couldn't travel. Sarah's face paled. I sold it. Daniel looked up. When? Last spring. She swallowed hard. I needed money for seed. For the first time since arriving, Daniel closed his eyes. Not in anger, in disappointment. Not at Sarah. At time. We'll build another. Sarah looked around the shed. With what? Daniel picked up one of the thick oak planks from a broken workbench. With whatever winter hasn't taken yet. Daniel had predicted 10 days. Winter gave them 6. The first snow came softly. The second came sideways. By the third day, the valley had disappeared behind a wall of white. The cottonwoods bent until their highest branches scraped one another. The temperature fell so quickly that the water bucket outside the bunkhouse froze solid before breakfast. Tommy stepped onto the porch. I've never seen it come this fast. Daniel looked toward the mountains. You weren't supposed to. Before sunrise, Eli shook Daniel awake. Dad, the barn's warm. Daniel sat upright instantly. Warm? Eli nodded. The hay. Both of them ran. Tommy and Sarah were already inside. Daniel plunged his arm deep into the center of one stack. Heat. Too much. He pulled his hand back. Damn. Sarah's heart pounded. What is it? The hay's cooking. Tommy remembered immediately. The tiny living things. Daniel nodded. They're making heat. Can it burn? It will. If we leave it. No speeches. No panic. Only movement. Daniel barked calm instructions. Tommy, open every upper vent. Eli, bring the hay hooks. Sarah, clear the center aisle. For the next 2 hours, they pulled every suspect bale into the snow. Steam poured from the stack like breath from a giant animal. Tommy stared. You were right. Daniel shook his head. I wasn't right. The hay was. That afternoon, black smoke appeared across the valley. Sarah climbed the watch hill. Walt. Daniel didn't answer. Flames climbed above the Ferris hay barn. Even through the storm, they could hear shouting. Tommy whispered, Should we help? Daniel was already hitching the horses. We're neighbors. We always help. When they arrived, half the barn roof had already collapsed. Walt stood in the snow, staring helplessly. My hay. Daniel looked once, then pointed. The east wall. Pull it down. Walt blinked. Are you crazy? If it falls inward, it'll bury the horses. Without another word, Daniel swung the axe. 1 cut. 2. 3. The weakened wall crashed outward instead of inward. The trapped horses bolted into the open. Walt simply stared. You knew. Daniel looked at the smoking hay. No, I guessed. But I guessed before the roof did. The real storm arrived that night. Not snow. A blizzard. Wind screamed across the valley at nearly 50 miles an hour. The snow fence Daniel had built disappeared beneath drifts exactly where he intended. Behind it, the lane remained open. The thinned cottonwoods no longer trapped mountains of snow. Instead, the drifts formed harmlessly in the pasture beyond. The raised hay floor stayed dry. The repaired roof beams groaned, but held. The insulated well pump refused to freeze. One by one, every quiet repair became the difference between survival and disaster. Then, just after midnight, the cattle began bawling. Daniel froze. They're moving. Sarah looked outside. They're in the south pasture. They shouldn't be. Daniel grabbed his coat. The fence. Tommy's eyes widened. The old creek fence. Daniel nodded once. It finally gave way. Outside, the world had vanished. The guide rope stretched from the house to the barn. Beyond that, nothing. Only white. Daniel clipped one end of a second rope around his waist. He handed the other end to Tommy. What did I teach you? Tommy swallowed. Never let the wind choose for you. Daniel smiled. Good. If this rope goes tight, don't pull. Anchor yourself. And wait. Tommy nodded. I won't let go. Daniel looked at Eli. What did I teach you about frightened horses? Stand where they can see me. Never behind them. Daniel smiled again. Exactly. Sarah stepped closer. And me? Daniel met her eyes. What did you learn? She took a steady breath. Preparation beats panic. For the first time all winter, Daniel allowed himself a grin. You've all been paying attention. Then he disappeared into the storm. The creek fence had collapsed beneath the weight of drifting snow. 23 head of cattle were slowly wandering toward the frozen creek. Daniel didn't chase them. He circled, exactly as he had taught the boys. Wind before movement, pressure before noise. He used the storm itself to turn the herd. One by one, the cattle drifted back toward the opening Sarah had left exactly where Daniel instructed weeks before. Not luck, planning. When the last cow crossed through, the frozen creek gave way. The ice shattered. Dark water swallowed the place where the herd had stood less than 30 seconds earlier. Daniel looked back once, then hurried home. The storm ended as suddenly as it had begun. Golden sunlight spilled across the valley. The ranch looked buried, but alive. Every horse stood safely inside the barn. Every cow had survived. The well still pumped. The roof still stood. The lane remained open. Even the chickens scratched through the shallow drift beside the coop. Hours later, the banker arrived on snowshoes. He removed his hat slowly as he surveyed the ranch. Then he looked toward Sarah. I've inspected ranches in this valley for 22 winters. He paused. I've never seen one come through a storm like this. Sarah smiled. Neither have I. The banker folded the foreclosure notice still tucked inside his coat. Without opening it, he tore it cleanly in half. You won't be needing this. That evening, the four of them sat around the kitchen table, the same table where Daniel had first made his impossible offer. Sarah ladled stew into 4 bowls, then reached for a 5th. Daniel looked up. "We're expecting someone?" She smiled. "No." She placed the bowl in front of Eli, then quietly said, "When you came here, you asked me to feed your son for 1 week." Daniel nodded. "I remember." Sarah looked around the room, at Tommy laughing with Eli, at the snow falling gently outside, at the warm kitchen Matthew had built with his own hands, then back at Daniel. "I think it's time I stopped counting the weeks." Silence filled the room, not awkward silence, the kind that only exists when everyone understands something too important to interrupt. Tommy grinned first. "So, does that mean they're staying?" Sarah laughed. "If they'll have us." Daniel looked at Eli. The boy's eyes were already shining. He turned back to Sarah. "I told you I'd save your ranch." She shook her head gently. "No, Daniel." Her voice caught. "You saved something much harder." He frowned. "What was that?" Sarah reached across the table and rested her hand over his. "Our home." Outside, the winter wind still swept across the Wyoming valley. It always would. But inside the Hargrove Ranch, winter had lost its greatest weapon. No one there would ever face it alone again. The strongest people aren't the ones who react when trouble arrives. They're the ones who prepare long before anyone else sees it coming. Kindness, wisdom, and quiet perseverance can save far more than hard work alone. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more unforgettable farm stories. And before you go, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what lesson did this story leave with you?